Hey friends, it's Rachel, welcome back to my channel, and welcome to another monthly reading wrap-up where I share with you the books I read this month. For the month of November, I read 7 books, so let's just jump right into it. The first book I read was The Way of Kings by Sanderson, and it has been some time since I read this book, and it is a very large book with a massive scope, so I will try my best to remember everything and explain what this book is about, but if you're curious, I do have a video dedicated solely to this book that shows my reactions in real time as I'm reading the book, essentially. This book was recommended to me by a friend. It is a epic fantasy that is over 1,000 pages long, and it is the first book in the Stormlight Archive series. The Way of Kings follows 3 main characters. Kaladin is a bridge man, and this is essentially somebody who has to help carry these large bridges in order to span chasms on the Shattered Plains, because there are armies fighting out there and they cannot cross the chasms, so every time there is a battle, the bridgemen have to carry the bridges, and it's a very hard job, it's a very dangerous job, and it's not a very good life to have. But that is where Kaladin finds himself. Shalyn is a scholar and a thief. Her family is currently struggling, and so she is attempting to apprentice herself to Jasna in order to steal something that Jasna has that will help reverse her family's fortunes. And Dalinar is a high prince who is involved with the battles taking place on the Shattered Plains. He receives visions every time a high storm comes that tells him that he needs to unite the kingdom of Alethkar and the High Princes and bring them together, but that is a task that is easier said than done. This is a massive book, and it has a massive scope. The world building in particular is very extensive, and while I did appreciate the level of effort and thought that obviously went into this, we didn't actually get to see that much of the world itself. Obviously this is part of a series. There are at least 10 books planned, 4 of which have been written, and The Way of Kings is the shortest so far, and it's still over 1,000 pages long. So currently we have a lot to work with, we have a lot to explore in the future books, but my biggest issue with this book was the pacing. We follow various different characters, and we have a lot of stuff to work with in terms of the world itself, which all should have been to this book's advantage, but I found the pacing to be very slow. I didn't care about any of the characters at the beginning aside from Shalyn. I found her storyline to be the most interesting, but ultimately I just found the pacing to be too slow. It didn't seem like the characters got anywhere, and it took them very long to change their circumstances. By the end of the book, I was pleasantly surprised. I did very much enjoy the ending, and I wish that the rest of the book could have been like that. And I was happy to see that the characters had changed in some way, or at least moved on from the circumstances that we found them in at the beginning of the book, but I thought it just took too long as a whole to get there, and epic fantasy is not my thing. I have come to that realization, and I will try to avoid epic fantasy in the future, but my biggest issue with this book was definitely the length. Next up we have The Creeping Shadow by Jonathan Stroud, and this is the 4th book in the Lockwood & Co. series, which is my favorite series. If you didn't know that already, I have a video dedicated solely to this series that can tell you more about it. This being the 4th book, I obviously can't say too much about it, but suffice to say that this book is about ghost hunters. In this alternative world, London has been beset by an epidemic of ghosts called the Problem, and these ghosts are dangerous and can only be seen by young people, children and teenagers. So various agencies have cropped up in order to deal with these ghosts, and these agencies are run by adults who then employ children agents, all except for one agency, which is Lockwood & Co. It consists of Anthony Lockwood, George Gubbins, and Lucy Carlyle, who comes to work for them in book 1, and each consecutive book in the series just furthers their adventures. What I like about the series is that each individual book is its own mystery. There's a central haunting that is the focus of the book, and yet the series as a whole focuses on the problem itself and the reasons behind it, and you learn a bit more about it with each new addition to the series. And so there's a mystery in each book that is different, but there's also an overarching mystery throughout the whole series. The characters in these books are just wonderful. They're realistic, they're fleshed out. I love the dialogue, I love the banter, which is usually not something that I enjoy. The world building is atmospheric, it's creepy, it's very detailed with all the different types of ghosts and the abilities that they have, and then the agents' tools that they use against these ghosts, and then of course the various agencies and their rivalries, and then it's just amazing. Like, the world building is so in-depth. It may not seem like it on the surface because this is still our world, but it's so eerily different from ours, and I picked up the first book in this series, The Screaming Staircase, in 2016, and it has been my favorite series ever since. I have not come across anything that comes close to this, and I may never ever find anything better than this, and I'm perfectly okay with that. I just encourage everybody who hasn't already to read it, give the series a try. I do not think you will be disappointed. And then finishing up my reread of the Lockwood & Co. series, we have The Empty Grave, also by Jonathan Stroud, which is the 5th and final book in the Lockwood & Co. series. Again, I cannot say anything because of spoilers, especially this being the final book. We are very far into the series, but this is the last one, and I recommend everybody to read it. Again, everything that I just said previously still applies, and I'm just very happy to have reread this series. I've read it a lot. I don't even remember how many times I've read it. These later books, obviously, I didn't have as many chances to read them as the earlier ones, just because the earlier books had been out longer, but it was nice to reread the whole series, and it just makes me happy every time I read it. So that's all I really have to say. Next we have The Coward by Stephen Aryan. This is a book that had been waiting patiently on my bookshelf for me to get around to reading it for over a year. This is the last book that I had that I hadn't yet read, that I picked up from one of my bookstore vlog videos, which was like the second video I think I've ever done on this channel or something. It's been a long time. So I finally got around to reading it. The premise of this book is that Kel Cresia is a hero. Several years ago, he and 11 other heroes, I believe was the number, journeyed to the frozen north and defeated the Ice Lich. However, all of the other heroes died, and Kel was the only one who survived. He beheaded the Ice Lich and returned home a hero, but on the inside he is a broken man who still suffers from the experiences he had in the frozen north. However, now the weather is turning again. The harvests are bad. Something has taken up residence in the Ice Lich's castle in the frozen north, and who is chosen to investigate but Kel? However, Kel does not want to go. He has done his part, and he just wants to live his life. He doesn't want to risk his life again because he is no hero. He's a coward. So what drew me initially to this book was the similarities between it and The Bone Maker. And if you don't know, I love The Bone Maker by Sarah Beth Durst. I just love it to bits. I love the characters. And the premise of that book was that 25 years ago, several heroes joined together to defeat the evil necromancer Eklor, only psych, they didn't actually kill him. He's back, and they have to choose whether to let somebody else be the heroes now and continue with the lives that they have currently, or to rise up and be heroes again and stop Eklor for good. It's not exactly the same because the heroes in The Bone Maker are actually heroes, they're not cowards, but the idea that they did this thing and it's over now and yet it's not quite over really interests me, so that's what drew me to The Coward initially. However, where The Bone Maker succeeds, The Coward did not work for me. First of all, this is not something I usually care about, but there were a lot of typos and grammatical errors in this book. Obviously, pretty much every book that is published has at least some errors in it, but because The Coward was a traditionally published book, I was pretty surprised by how many mistakes there were. It was almost as though it wasn't edited or proofread at all, and while this is one of the more minor things, when there are that many of them, it does get to be distracting, and I guess I just expect better from a traditionally published book. It definitely felt like it needed more work. Another thing about this was that the writer seemed to have an aversion to commas. There were not commas where there should have been most of the time, and there were sometimes commas where there should not have been. And this was my biggest issue in terms of mistakes made with the writing style, grammatical issues, because it makes it more difficult to read if there's no commas. There's next to no flow, and it's just harder for somebody to read it without commas. So that was a big issue that I had with that, but it wasn't the biggest issue. Overall, this book was just okay. I would have liked to see more being done with certain characters, Willow in particular. She is not a human character, she's something else. I'm not exactly sure what she is because she's very mysterious, and while that mystery does make her character interesting, it's never fully explored, and so we never actually get much more out of her than we do at the beginning. It doesn't feel like enough. Like, mystery is okay, but eventually you're going to have to give the reader more information about things, but I didn't feel like we got enough when it came to her character. This book also suffers from telling rather than showing, and it's not very subtle when it does tell. The deaths that occur are pretty much quickly glossed over, and they're kind of pointless. I get that death sometimes happens fast, but the characters who die, there's no reason for them to die. And when it came to one character in particular, it just felt like the author had it in for him from the very beginning, and when he finally died, I was not surprised. This book is a very simple story overall. I'm not sure that it makes complete sense, and it's not very deep. The religious system in this book felt kind of weird and very similar to our world. In fact, the whole world building with this was very similar to our world, and it makes sense that because we live here, we would take inspiration from our own world and put it in our fantasy worlds, but when it's that obvious, it takes me out of the fantasy world. And that's just my personal opinion. The religious system felt a lot like Catholicism. There's a secondary character called Mother Britak, I believe, and we get several chapters from her points of view. She is nowhere near the main character. She is not really involved with what's going on with them. She just wants one of them to be killed, but anyway, it's very clear that she's some sort of religious zealot. She's like the Pope, I guess, in this world, the equivalent of, considering how much power she wields. And she's basically brainwashing people to become religious zealots, to become soldiers in a future holy war that she has planned. This is a duology. The Coward is just the first book. However, I looked into the blurb of the second book and it doesn't seem to have anything much to do with the first book, so it doesn't really feel like they're connected at all. I guess Mother Britak would play a bigger role in book 2. I'm not sure. She is a very interesting character in terms of her personality and her motivations, I suppose, and yet it felt odd having her inserted in this book, given what the other plotline was about. And last but not least, I try to be as objective in my reviews as possible. I try to look at the technical aspects of writing rather than whether I just disliked something or not. However, it is inevitable that I am subjective in some of my views. Some of them are simply my opinion, and this is definitely one of those things, so it's just my opinion. But I do want to make mention of it. And I don't know what it is about some books that I read by male authors, particularly fantasy, but I don't understand why they feel the need or the desire to talk about their own anatomy quite so much. And I'm not saying that this is something that all male writers do, because obviously they don't, but I have noticed it often enough that it is a sort of theme, especially within the fantasy genre. I know I give romance a hard time for the fantasies that are on display in those books because of the unrealistic aspect to it, but with a romance that's kind of par for the course. I mean, you expect that. These fantasy books are an opportunity to act out a fantasy of a different kind, if you get my meaning. And this wasn't the whole point of the book, but it did keep coming up. Characters would just talk about and think about their own anatomy, and characters would also remark on other characters' anatomy. And I'm just like, why? Why is this here? Would they even do that? Would this really happen? Anyway, suffice to say that it came up often enough in this book that I found it annoying and unrealistic. And it didn't really make for a great deal of diversity from one character's personality to the next, but all in all, I think what the character Bronwyn in this book said was true. In my experience, men who talk big are small where it counts. I'll just leave that there. Speaking of romances, next up we have Seoulmates by Susan Lee, and I also have a video dedicated solely to this book as well if you'd like to check that out. This is a Korean romance, and that's why I picked it up, because as I said, I don't really like romance, but I do find Korean culture as a whole interesting, and this book in particular is on K-dramas, which I have not yet watched, but I do fully intend to watch them. The premise of this book is that the main character Hannah lives in San Diego, and her childhood friend Jacob is a K-drama star who lives and works in Seoul, but he ends up coming to stay at Hannah's house for the summer. And they're not really friends anymore. Their friendship kind of broke apart because Jacob just left to go work in Seoul as a K-drama star, and he didn't really tell Hannah that. They didn't really do a good job at keeping in touch, so there's some resentment there that they have to work through. But anyway, he comes back, he's in Hannah's life again, and obviously they repair their friendship, and since this is a romance, it's a childhood friends to lovers type deal. One thing I will say about this book is that the chemistry between the two characters made sense. They had a previous relationship, they were friends, they've known each other since they were children, so it makes sense that they have this sort of chemistry and that they would eventually fall for each other and become something more than just friends. That makes perfect sense. It was also interesting to learn a bit more about K-dramas and the restrictive nature of the business. And I knew that was kind of the case with K-pop stars, K-pop idols, and it's very restrictive. Their lives are micromanaged to the extreme. Every little thing is controlled, and it kind of sounds like it would not be a fun time, but if that's what you enjoy doing, I guess it's all worth it. But anyway, Jacob does not enjoy doing this. This is not who he really is. This is not what he really wants. But he needs the money from his job to support his family, and so that is the conflict. He cannot choose a relationship with Hannah without losing his position as a K-drama star, and if he does that, then he will lose the financial security that he has obtained for his family. I was also pleasantly surprised by how many Korean terms that were in this book that I already knew, and then I did learn quite a few more as a result, so that was nice, a nice surprise. But all in all, I did not like this book. Despite it being on a topic that I both enjoy and find interesting, that just wasn't enough. I really did not like the ending of this book. I really hated the back and forth between the two characters. They flip-flop so much. Once or twice I can understand, but they just kept flip-flopping back and forth between he loves me, he doesn't love me, I don't know what to do kind of a deal. There was one scene in particular that really irritated me. Jacob has gone to the hotel with the people from the company that he works for in Seoul. They are going to be flying back to Seoul, and they have not yet left for the airport, and so Hannah sees this as her last chance before he is gone to confess her feelings and explain how she really feels and that they're going to make it work no matter what. And yet when she arrives, she happens to witness Jacob and his co-star in the K-drama that he's in having a romantic moment that is of course completely staged, and Hannah thinks that to herself, he's just acting, right? It's just acting, right? Even though she knows this, she proceeds to doubt it, and instead of this being this moment that she had envisioned for herself, she just ends up leaving without telling Jacob how she feels at all. We see all of this confidence that she had in the moment before she arrived, you know, working up to this, and it just completely leaches away in that moment, and she fails. She doesn't do what she came to do. While I understand that it's easy to feel confident in the moment versus when you actually get there and having all that confidence just leach away, the way that it played out in this book was quite irritating to me to have to read that. It's like, girl, please just make up your mind. Just do what you said you were going to do. But of course we can't have it that easy. I know that a central thing in romances is with part of the conflict, once the characters get together, there has to be various things that happen where they can't be together or their relationship is in doubt, because that is the whole point of this book, is the romance. And so the conflict has to center around the romance. There can't really be anything else. Actually, there kind of can be, but I've only encountered that in the romances that I have liked. We'll get to that later. But anyway, overall, my biggest issue with Seoulmates was that I found it to be cheesy. Like, the cheese factor was really strong with this book, and in the end, I did not enjoy it. Up next, we have XOXO by Axie Oh. This is the second Korean romance that I read, and this one I saved for last because I thought I would like it more, because it has to do with K-pop, and I do love K-pop. And yes, I did enjoy it more than Seoulmates, but in the end, it didn't work for me either. Surprise, surprise. I don't really like romance. But the premise of this book is that the main character Jenny lives in LA, and on a night out during a Korean festival, she runs into Jae-woo, who is, unbeknownst to her, a famous K-pop idol. They spend the evening together doing various things around LA, and then he has to fly back to Seoul. And he doesn't text her back, and she doesn't see him again. She doesn't expect to see him again. But then her mother comes to her and tells her that her grandmother, who lives in Seoul, is not doing well. She's not in the best of health, so her mother is going to go there to be with her, and Jenny tags along. She transfers to a performing arts school in Seoul because she is a cello player, and wouldn't you know it, Jae-woo just happens to go to that exact same high school. This feels a little contrived to me. I don't really know what it's like to have elite performing arts schools in Korea, and it could be completely possible that most K-pop idols, while they're still in school or they're trainees or whatever, do end up going to only a handful of schools, so maybe it's not that unreasonable to think that Jenny could just happen to go to the same school that Jae-woo does, but it feels a little bit contrived in that way that most things in romances feels contrived sometimes, because you have to get the characters together. That is the whole point, as I said. That is the plot. That is the conflict. And I think the problem with having the romance be the entire point, the entire plot, is that it can sometimes be introduced to the story too soon before sufficient chemistry is built up between the characters, whereas if you have a book like a fantasy where there's a romantic element to it but it's not the whole point, you can introduce it later on after sufficient chemistry has been developed, because that's not the whole point to the book. You have other things, but if it's the whole point, then you have to have it in there at some point. And I just didn't believe in the chemistry between Jae-woo and Jenny. I didn't see why they should get together. The chemistry seemed to be limited to the fact that she thought he was hot, and of course he's hot, he's a K-pop idol, it's kind of a requirement. But anyway, what I would have liked to see is, why did he pick her? Why did he pick Jenny? He could have picked anybody, so what was it about her that was so special? It could have been the fact that she didn't recognize him when she saw him in LA, because she didn't realize that he was a famous K-pop idol, and most people do, and that's why they're interested in him. So if he found a girl who wasn't interested in him because of his fame, that could be very interesting, because it's unusual, and it does make her different and not like the other girls. But we didn't really get to explore that because we don't get any any points of view from Jai-woo. We don't get his perspective. We never know what he's thinking. Seoulmates gave us points of views from both Jacob and Hannah, both in first-person point of view, which I thought was a little weird, just because I'm not exactly sure that I fully believe that Jacob's point of view is completely realistic, but I could be completely wrong. I don't think overall I'm a huge fan of dual point of view romances, but I do think, funnily enough, that XOXO could have benefited from that, because then we would have known what Jai-woo was thinking and why he picked Jenny, why was he attracted to Jenny in the first place. Instead, all we get is why Jenny's attracted to him, and that's because he's hot. But it is what it is. I thought that Seoulmates did better on the chemistry, but XOXO did lack the cheese factor that Seoulmates had. It wasn't quite as cheesy, and so that's why I liked it more, but all in all, at the end, I don't know how realistic that this is. I don't know if I believe in it, and it certainly wasn't enough for me to like this romance book, even though it was on a subject that I am interested in. But, as I mentioned earlier, with the conflict usually surrounding the relationship itself, let's move on to the final book, and it is a romance that I did enjoy. And I will tell you why it worked for me and why that is. And that is Dreaming About the Boy Next Door by Sarah Sutton. This is the second book in the Most Likely To series. I read Teaching the Teacher's Pet, which was the first one, and I enjoyed it very much, and I enjoyed this one just as well, even though they're very different. So this book follows Ava, who runs a blog, basically. It's like a gossip site for the high school, and every year there's a Most Likely To list put out in which people are assigned titles, basically, and not all of them are flattering. And this year, Ava happens to be assigned one herself, which is most likely to never have her first kiss. And this is a source of embarrassment for her because people think ill of that. This is high school, after all, high school drama. Anyway, while Ava is spending the night over at her best friend Rachel's house, she encounters Rachel's brother Reed, who is a football player who recently quit the team, and Ava suddenly comes up with the brilliant idea that it would be a good idea to kiss Reed just to get it out of the way, and then she wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. And so that is exactly what happens, only instead of it being just a quick little peck that shouldn't mean anything, it causes Ava to catch feelings, basically. And whether he chooses to admit it or not, Reed is also guilty of that. But the two characters don't want to admit that to each other. They just want to pretend like it's fine, we can move on as friends, or maybe even not even that, because we were never really friends in the first place, and conflict ensues from that. So you do have a conflict surrounding the relationship itself in that neither of these two want to admit that they caught feelings for the other. They dance around this issue and it causes tension between them, but that's not the only conflict and tension in this book. One of the things I really appreciated about this book was how it hits you with the emotions, because Ava and Reed are both going through hard times with their family lives. Both of their parents are divorced, so there are divorces that are happening in both families. These teenagers are having to go through this, and it's a very hard time. It's a hard time of adjustment, and on top of that, Ava's mother is struggling financially. She's struggling to pay bills, and Ava may very well lose her house that she has lived in all her life that is across the street from our best friend. And so the family life in this book really comes into play. It really hits you with the emotions. It's very realistic. One of the things that I was so impressed by when I read The Teaching the Teacher's Pet, which was the first book by Sarah Sutton that I had yet read, was how realistic she makes her characters. It's effortless. They feel like real people, which is what I don't usually get in the other romances that I have read. They feel like real people. Their struggles are real. They are relatable, and the chemistry is there. Sarah Sutton takes the time and the effort to build the chemistry between her two characters. We're not doing insta-love here. So I really appreciated that, and I think that these books are examples of romances that can work. I can't entirely say that I don't like romance because I liked these, and so romances, I guess, are just like anything else. You can find a good one, but it's not always easy. So there you have it. Those are all of the books I read in November. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!